A group of college students stumble across an old book from the rare book section of the college library. And from this book, they accidentally summon a dragon from the long dark to our own reality. Unfortunately, this dragon forces them into a sinister pact. Either they sacrifice somebody to the dragon every single year, or the dragon begins to devour them one by one. This is the premise to Joe Hill's King Sorrow, and I would argue that this is probably his magnum opus. This novel is nearly 900 pages, and I don't think a page is wasted. It's an incredible coming-of-age story, an incredible story of friendship and growth and change, a story of sacrifice and adventure and heroism. So let's talk about everything I liked, everything I didn't like, and whether or not you should read King Sorrow by Joe Hill. As I mentioned in the intro to this video, this is a book about college students who find a way to summon a dragon to our reality from this mythical place called the Long Dark. But when I initially heard about this book, I thought it was going to be more of a dark academia, kind of college students figuring out how they can use this monstrous dragon's power to further their own ends. And I thought it was going to feel a little bit like Death Note meets... what's that book by Donna Tartt? I'll put it on screen. But it's the book where a group of kids are dealing with like a murder on campus. I thought this was going to be mostly that, and I was very pleasantly surprised by the fact that this is more of an epic that spans decades, following multiple characters. This feels much more in the vein of some of those larger Stephen King type tomes. Now, I will say, one other book that I had heard this compared to was It, and I don't think this is that much like It. Structurally, it doesn't do the same thing where it's kind of following two different timelines. This very much is sequential, like we start in college with these characters and we follow them through the course of a couple of decades throughout their lives as everything relating to this dragon King Sorrow kind of unfold and all of the complications that happen with them and between them and their relationships because of this situation that they're trapped in. So structurally, it's not really like It. It's also not fully a coming-of-age story in the sense of starting from, like, actual childhood, like kids being 8, 9, 10, 11. This starts, again, in college. So we're starting with characters who are 17, 18, 19, and then following them from there. But I think what's similar to It is the scope in the sense of we're following multiple characters in a group of friends over a long period of time. So if you like that aspect of It, you might like that aspect of this a little bit. We're also dealing with a very supernatural, cosmic, almost Lovecraftian entity. This dragon is from the Long Dark, which is some unfathomable place. And he is kind of an impossible creature. Like, obviously, he's a dragon, but he doesn't just show up as a dragon that eats someone. He also shows up in people's mind or their subconscious. He speaks to them in the reflection of a mirror if he has a connection to you. There's some horror elements with how King Sorrow interacts with the world that feels, again, kind of Lovecraftian or eldritch in a way that kind of echoes a little bit the sense of It, where the creature in It is able to kind of show up in a variety of ways, shall we say. So there is that element of it, and also this culmination of eventually they have to find a way to stop this dragon that they've unleashed, and kind of like It, there's a culmination to that. But that's kind of, those are the broad stroke similarities. I think ultimately this story feels a lot different. This story feels more Arthurian in nature. It feels like a group of friends who kind of become this round table. But it also kind of takes on this Death Note element where they have a super powered weapon, essentially. They can point once a year at someone and just eliminate them. This dragon is pretty much unstoppable, but he's only going to kill someone once a year. The key is if they don't unanimously choose and agree on someone to kill, by the time Easter rolls around, then the dragon is going to choose one of them and kill them. So I think what is really interesting about this is whereas something like It is focusing on this group of friends kind of growing apart and coming back together over the years and having to reconnect with their childhood and confront something like a trauma from their past, this is more a story of dealing with the consequences of a decision made in your young adulthood as you become older, and is also very much a study of how different people grow apart and grow in different ways and change. And the way we change is reflected by our various traumas and life experiences. But also that kind of starts to put a wedge between people. And so this group of friends we follow, they all start to have different opinions about what's the right way to utilize this dragon. Should they be killing this person or that person? You know, is this starting to verge on the territory of acting in a way that is beyond something that they can comprehend? It's kind of the classic problem with power, like too much power corrupts. And you see that corruptive influence within the friend group, and different people have different thoughts on. Some of them feel like this is a bad power and they need to stop this dragon, whereas some of the friends are like, this is great, you know, we can kill bad people with this, which is true. So there's some real interesting moral dilemmas and quandaries that we face from different friends and from different friends' perspectives throughout the novel. So I've kind of touched on the structure and the fact that we're following this friend group. I think one of the best things about this book is the characters. The characters are so realistically drawn. Joe Hill, so I don't think I touched on this yet. Joe Hill is actually Stephen King's son, and you can see it in the way he writes. Not just from the fact that, oh, he writes, you know, horror stories that are big and thick like his dad or whatever. He's a really good writer. I think Joe Hill is verging on like the same level of quality of his dad with some of his works. And I think he has this ability to draw a super flawed character and make you believe in them and make you understand their flaws and who they are and what they care about, what they don't care about, and make you love and hate characters fairly quickly, but then over the course of this book, make you come to really deeply understand them. And there are some characters in this that I started out and kind of liking, and then I kind of came to hate them. And then by the end, I came to understand them so deeply that I still was frustrated with certain decisions, and I still didn't agree with some of the characters and what they ultimately decided or what they believed, but I understood them and I cared about them and my heart was broken for them. Now, there's also some antagonists in this. One of the antagonists is so hateable, but in the way that you love in a good fiction novel, like a hateable antagonist for all the right reasons. And so there's hateable characters, and then there are lovable characters who you grow to love more and more and are flawed and they make bad decisions, but they also eventually overcome their struggles, and it's beautiful. And by the end of this novel, I was actually a little bit teary-eyed at this journey I'd had with these characters and the need to say goodbye and really not wanting this book to end. And I think one of the best compliments you can give for a book that is this large is when you don't want it to end. Another thing I adored about this book are some of the action sequences. Joe Hill does action really well. So this is kind of a horror book, but kind of a fantasy book. You know, again, you have a dragon coming into our real world, and there are some really cool sequences of the dragon wreaking havoc and like blowing up machinery. And there are some cool aerial scenes with the dragon. There are some cool scenes of destruction on the ground. There are some really great set pieces. I don't want to give anything away or spoil it because some of these things were so fun to stumble across on my own that I'll just let you read it. But some of the set pieces are truly epic and just like the best action you could hope for. This also had some really fun Arthurian fantasy flavoring to it. So again, Joe Hill is often known as a horror writer, and his stuff straddles horror and fantasy, kind of like Stephen King. And this is one of those books that, yeah, there's a horror element to this dragon that is destroying things and like kind of haunting people a little bit and like whispering in their ear. And the place he comes from, the Long Dark, is kind of connected to some of the other lore from Joe Hill's other novels, which, as a side note, Joe Hill does what Stephen King does, where he's kind of connecting his universes just lightly, and it's really fun. It's not over the top, but you get some Easter eggs of like the way certain magic or ghost things or stuff from other novels kind of are connected to this. You get the sense that this is in the same world with some of his other stories. You also get some references to Stephen King novels, both in terms of like maybe these worlds are connected, but you also get some cool allusions or throwbacks in the text that if you're a fan of Stephen King, you might recognize, say, a certain politician from The Dead Zone. That was one of my favorite references because I think The Dead Zone is one of Stephen King's best novels, and nobody ever talks about that. I'll make a video about that in the future. There's a reference to It. There's a reference to The Gunslinger. There's a lot of fun references. And again, it doesn't pull you out of it, but it's nice flavoring to the story. And somehow Joe Hill manages to walk this line of like being in the shadow of his dad, Stephen King, and writing very similar types of stories. And stylistically, I would say Joe Hill is kind of similar to Stephen King, but he also feels like his own author, totally. Like the way he writes really feels like him. Like a Joe Hill novel is a Joe Hill novel. And I can feel the difference. Like I can see how close it is to Stephen King, and I also can see how different it is from Stephen King. And I love that. He's kind of like our generation's Stephen King. I don't know. Stephen King's also my generation Stephen King, but you know what I mean. He's like kind of the new guard that fills the role of Stephen King, in my opinion. If anyone could, it's him. And that's pretty awesome to have. I want to talk just a little bit more on the Arthurian stuff because I love a good fantasy novel, and Joe Hill ties in Arthurian stuff with obviously King Sorrow. One of our main characters is named Arthur. Another character is named Gwen. So there's definitely some playing with the Arthurian legend, but in his own way and with his own, characters. And it's kind of a light connection to the Arthurian stuff, but there are elements of Arthurian legend that get pulled in throughout the story in pretty interesting ways. There's one other thing Joe Hill does that you'll kind of recognize from his other works, where he takes like the gritty grossness of horror. This is also kind of a Stephen King adjacent thing. But if you have read Nosferatu or Lock and Key or some of his other things, there's just a sense of like grimy, grungy darkness. There's like some dark, dirty corners in his world that you can kind of feel, even though you're not always in that. And you occasionally get a point of view character who's from the dark, grimy part of the world, which is also kind of a little reminiscent of something like Stephen King or It, where you have that one unhinged character who you occasionally jump into their heads for one reason or the other. So those are all the things I like. That's a pretty long section. I mostly am going to be glowing about this book because I think it's a really great book. In terms of things that I didn't like, there's not much I didn't like about this. This was a pretty much all across the board sweep for me. I will say Joe Hill writes some uncomfortable scenes and dialogue with characters. There's some gross characters who like just have really bad outlooks on life and how they think about people. And there are some decisions that some characters make that are certainly not the types of things good people would do. And so I think depending on your comfort levels, like there might be some scenes or some character perspectives that occasionally are a touch uncomfortable, kind of like reading Stephen King. So if you've read Stephen King and you know how you feel about him, I feel like you kind of get a sense for how you're going to feel about Joe Hill. But again, overall, I don't really have many complaints about this book. The pacing was pretty dang good. I think right as it got to the point around the halfway 2/3 mark that I was starting to feel like maybe it's going to slow down a little bit and I'm going to have to push through to the ending, right as that feeling was barely starting to crest, something crazy happens. And so he does a great job with pacing and subverting expectations and like really taking you on this wild ride. I really didn't know where this story was going for the majority of it. And I'm pretty good at like clocking the overall structure of stories generally. He did a good job keeping me on my toes. This was a wild ride. And again, ultimately an incredible work of character. If you like Joe Hill, I think you'll really like this. If you like Stephen King, I think you'll really like this. If you haven't tried either of them, I think this is still worth trying because this is a character-driven, epic fantasy, urban fantasy, horror, Arthurian action thriller adventure that is totally worth your time. I love Joe Hill's work. This is probably his magnum opus. So, I think that's it. I loved it. Have you read King Sorrow? What did you think about this book? Have you read any other Joe Hill books? But mostly, I would love to talk in the comments about King Sorrow and what you thought about it. And maybe in the future, I think one of my next videos will be where to start reading Joe Hill, because I think you could start reading Joe Hill with this book because this is a great book. But he has some other books that are maybe a little easier to get into because this one's huge. So that video will come soon. But again, thanks for watching. Thanks for spending some time with me. I'll be back soon with more fantasy, sci-fi, horror content. But until then, enjoy your reading. I need to figure out like a cool catchphrase. But thanks for watching.